Thank you. Angela said to have fun, so I hope the key component of the next 45 minutes or whatever is simply just to have fun. I'm probably going to show you things you've seen before, probably topics you have run through your own minds, whether it's in the context of an event like this or just passing through the community. But generally, I want to start with a quote from a La Jolla architect. I worked on a documentary. I had a previous career at KPBS, and one of the byproducts of my work there was a documentary on the differences and the coming together of San Diego and Tijuana as a region. And one of the things that Mark said in our interview with him was that we're just in a first draft of San Diego. And so tonight I kind of want you to at least leave with this idea that I'm trying to put forth, which is we're in the first draft of San Diego and we're the first draft of La Jolla, okay? What the future drafts are, none of us can venture a guess. But we've already seen some slight edits. We're not in a full draft yet, but we've definitely seen some editing in the last 100 or so years. So that's kind of the foundation, the context I want to lay for what we're going to do is fly through a great many slides just to kind of keep you in that frame and try to guess what the next iteration is. So we go from that kind of sand, coming all the way up to the front doorsteps to what is essentially a clustering of tight door to door to door to door, address to address spaces. In some cases where you'll see larger, taller private residences and single-story residences that are sunk below the street level. But what they're essentially doing from the street is blocking much of our connection or our interface with the ocean. For better or for worse, for private property rights and all that, that's kind of a separate context. But what I wanted to do really is kind of just draw upon this idea that everybody was part of the ocean when they were in La Jolla, and the ocean was part of every portion of La Jolla back in the day. And now we've created these barricades, as it were. And it's just one way of thinking about what a future draft might be. Maybe if the oceans raise, if you believe Ralph Keeling and his father, and if you own property in La Jolla Shores, La Jolla Shores will probably be engulfed by the tides at some point. And so the draft would change not by our design, but by nature's design. So the coastal properties already have this interesting future in and of themselves. Whether or not it's a built environment, a man-made structure impeding your view, or these views being changed over time. So one of the ways to think about the drafting process as we think about San Diego and Tijuana together or separate as a region, or La Jolla going through its growth spurts, is to kind of talk about some examples, right? It's always easier to put in your mind an example. And there's a fairly storied past about Red Rest and Red Roost on Coast Boulevard. And the easiest thing to do is just kind of show you a picture like this and say, obviously, in a mere short span of time of only a couple of decades, something can go from fairly prominent to decaying. And I don't want to get into, there's a lot of politics and a lot of narrative behind this issue, but imagine just, if you walked by here, this picture was taken in the early 70s, if I recall correctly, and this picture was taken in 2004-ish. And just one thing, one house, one address, one plot of land. It's obviously an important piece of property. It's right on the cove, and many of our visitors and us as residents swing by this property all the time. Now, a good way of looking back in time is to see a horse-drawn carriage, right? It immediately dates and facilitates this, well, how long has La Jolla really been here? And who are these guys with the horse? And then you say, well, here's the same site, and while it may not be the same building, it wasn't a preservation issue, it wasn't a heated discussion about the community changing, it's still a wonderfully executed place where the cave and the shell shop and where people kind of come and interface with that part of La Jolla. We might not go there daily, but certainly it is a gathering place for many of our visitors. And while we can talk about, well, gosh, don't we wish that building was still there? Well, as long as the utility hasn't changed, we're obviously going to lose buildings in the drafting process. So let's come to terms with, at least if we lose a building, that the integrity and the reason the reason it's a hub or a part of the community, the fabric of the community, remains intact. And I think that's a great example. One of the obvious examples, I mean, if you Google La Jolla, the La Valencia comes up. And I'm sure as you do, you just love these pictures of the early Ford motor cars in the early part of the century. And you know, I could add color to this, but it's just, you know, it's not just it's a black and white photo. Those cars really frame like, well, how much has really changed? And you know, one could argue not much, right? So it isn't like this is a preservation win or this is a battle that was fought and somebody retained victory. And it's really great to just say, well, you know, La Jolla, even though it changes, it still remains much the same. Not by address, but overall the La Valencia, for many of us, demonstrates a broader sense of why La Jolla is staying true to its roots or holding on to some of its key icons. So even if you lose a house somewhere, down the street even, you still say, well, you know, something really wonderful came in its place and for the most part is still with us. So we can lament that we've lost this building, but then what would happen, and there's a whole set of debates about if somebody tears this building down, what is the next building? And then, you know, at what stage does your lamentation, does your affect, does your sadness have its borders? I actually never saw this building. I'm a native San Diegan and I never saw this, but I've seen this since I was a kid, and that's what I truly have always understood the Green Dragon to be. And every time I see that building, I'm at least thankful that, you know, one artifact of one of the drafts really is still there. I guess that's kind of the MO I'm trying to present. So as I talk about La Jolla, I'm going to reach a little bit outside of La Jolla as it might properly be defined. We're going to go to UTC later, so bear with me. And you're like, oh no, not UTC, but bear with me. And I am an employee of UC San Diego, so I don't want, you know, everyone to be like I'm here for propaganda's sake. I'll just make that clear. But what I find is really fascinating, because La Jolla is so residentially oriented, is that so much of the commercial and public sector place is through the university setting. So as you watch the university grow, you really can create timelines and timetables of how the residential and the commercial architecture in the village have kind of ebbed and flowed, have changed over time. So certainly what a picture like this does, circa about 1920, is tells you, well, God, there was still a lot of dirt, right? Still a lot of scrub brush, still a lot of open land available, even at Scripps. And while that pier has been replaced and everything has been built over, you'll notice that the Irving Gill original library is still with us today. It's been modified a bit in the 50s. But generally speaking, this infill has been happening routinely. And if you looked at an aerial view of La Jolla over decades, what you would generally notice is that you know, right after World War II, pretty much every plot of residential land was filled in. And the universities still had some open space all the way through the 60s and 70s and 80s. So if you take an aerial photograph, you know, every 5 or 10 years, it looks like Scripps is full, right? You'd think, wow, they can't build another building there. But in effect, the NOAA building that's going up right now is yet another draft. It's another addition. And it's finding more pockets of land to build. And UCSD has to struggle with a limited geographic zone in which to do all the activities they want to do and grow within. So the drafting process is probably more accelerated than anywhere else. And to speak, you'll see a thread about Irving Gill certainly throughout tonight, but the Scripps Library is a really interesting example of a building that has had, I mean, arguably different business take place in it since its beginning. It was a lab, it was a classroom, it was a library, and it's certainly office space today. But at the hub of the whole campus down the street from us, This one building's been historically designated, and it's sort of not only for La Jolla, it's for the greater community, it's for the national architectural community to appreciate and understand that as this drafting process goes, all you really have to do is save one or two of these iconic buildings to keep that fabric alive. So the old director's house, the old director's cottage, which was a residence for the Scripps director, was lovingly restored. And even though you could lament and be sad about all the buildings that we've lost in the community over the decades, just having this one building or this other building, just a couple of these kind of remain intact as you walk through the brand new architecture by by contemporary architects, you still have that sense that, gosh, Scripps has probably been here, and La Jolla, therefore, by default, has been here for a long time. Just one other example is the old Scripps library and the old Scripps lab, and then you just see the infill, right? It's just this natural kind of progression. Local architects, local architecture firms are producing this new draft collaboratively, and granted the sun's shining and the birds are chirping and the flowers are blooming in this picture, and the other one is by contrast black and white, but you get a sense that these spaces are really maturing around us. And just one other example is there's the library, or there's Ritter Hall. It's been basically reframed by its environment, but the building is intact. Nothing inside is the same. And from an architect's perspective, I was talking to an architect the other day who said, Keith, you keep showing all these pictures of the exteriors of buildings, and we don't work that way. We work from the core, the inside, what the building is, what's going to go on in the house or the medical facility or the laboratory or the insurance offices. We start from the inside and then we work out, and you keep showing people pictures of the outside, and that's the last part of the chain. And I said, well, yeah, but a building like this has had so many different uses in its lifespan, not ever intending to be a green building, right? But it's been very green. It's been very environmentally stable because it, for the most part, has stayed intact, and just the rooms and the utility of the rooms inside it have changed. So I'm always like trying to wonder, well, when I do show you a picture like this, what does that really mean? You're like, oh, that building's still being used the same way it was in 1916. I'm like, by God, no, it couldn't be. But presents some interesting clues. But again, going back, I'm sort of kind of going to go forward in time a little bit, but Herbert Palmer did a couple of really interesting things in San Diego, and two key ones are in La Jolla, and I think this one's sorely missed, right? It's overlooked, it's walked through, it's walked by, it's walked towards, and people don't really actually sit back and think, well, gosh, that's quite an amazing little journey, right? Just not even walking through it, but just kind of staying and saying, hey, what is this? What does this mean? It's not a house, it's not a bank, it's not an office building. It's just this little arcade, this wonderful little alleyway. And then, obviously, by all measures of certainty, everyone knows this building, and yet, what do we really know about it? And it's sort of like this other thing. It's like, what do we really know about that? It's certainly not one for me to say, okay, well, in Herbert Palmer's career, it means this, and in the history books, in the timeline of La Jolla being built, it means this. I'm just saying, what if we stop as pedestrians and kind of rethink? Next time you're driving down Torrey Pines, and rethink what you see when you just see the top of this building. And of course, the love affair I have with these photographs is what's behind it, right? Everything's been filled in beyond that building. So the background of this photo, if you were to be at the same vantage point today, looks nothing like that. And that's one of the favorite things about these drafting processes is, while maybe some of those houses are not there or they've been remodeled, there's certainly a hell of a lot more of them today than there were when this picture was taken. And it just causes a lot of wonderment. I was born in the late 60s in San Diego, and I've seen a lot of this drafting process happen, right? Where once was an empty lot is now a building. And my wife, who's newer to San Diego, when we drive by something, I'm like, gosh, for half my life that was an empty lot, or for half my life that was a church and it's no longer there, it's a parking lot. And so every time I see these pictures, it just constantly keeps us alive and thinking about what we've actually witnessed. There's this property that, let me just stop for 1 second and say, the whole real estate market is one of an architectural historian's best friends, right? A synergy between what comes up for sale because somebody goes into a house and rephotographs it and says, hey, all you buyers out there, here's a house from the 1930s with one of the best beachfront pieces of property still intact by any stretch of the imagination. And I go, wow, so as soon as this house gets listed, someone goes and photographs it. I go, that house is still there? I've driven by that address a million times. Behind the hedge, you can't really see if it's still there. And then you see a photograph like this taken by the real estate agent to market the property. And you're like, my goodness, it's not only still there, it's well preserved, it's intact. And you say, and sometimes the oddest things happen about, digging through history books and then going, wow, the real estate pages are presenting more history on a daily basis than we ever really understand. Obviously, I've been asked this question. I've given mutations of this talk in a myriad of times, and people are like, well, what is San Diego architecture? Is there a California architecture? Is there a La Jolla style? And the answer is always no. Okay, it's very difficult to say yes when you're not talking about like Athens, right? I mean, like, there isn't this defining epic of time when all the architecture was done one style, it landed in La Jolla, and so therefore everything of La Jolla gets identified with that style. But some things to consider are the La Jolla architects, the folks that did a lot of work or worked from their La Jolla office and brought a unique style to La Jolla. Certainly Irving Gill is the first that comes to mind. His colleagues, his brother, his fellow architects in his office, they all contribute. But when someone says, what is innate or unique about San Diego and La Jolla, you just say Irving Gill. And while bypassed in his time, it's come to understand, like, when people see this building, it is La Jolla. It is very much part of the fabric that we understand La Jolla to be. People don't like his work. People try to understand how it fits into the chronology. People wonder why he was doing this, and the history books were talking about Sullivan and Wright across the country and others in Europe at the same time. But while we can all debate that, I mean, he presents a case for us to say Irving Gill's architecture is more La Jolla than Spanish colonial or Tudor revival. Right? It just is. It is actually, it was born here. So something to just ponder and think about as we go through lots of pictures. Bruce Richards, who I'm a big fan of, and I've been trying to understand his life over the last several years, not only worked at the old Tyrolean off of Coast, but most of his projects are either in Point Loma or in La Jolla, and there's probably no other 20th century architect that you can say is just San Diego. I mean, 90% of his work is San Diego. He lived in San Diego. He worked in San Diego. He raised his family in San Diego. It's San Diego all the way back to when he was age 16 and he came here on his first trip. But there's a bunch of these cedar houses with pitched roofs and lots of glass and lots of wood, and they some people think it's more Bay Area architecture, it's more Bernard Maybach, but when you sit there and you think about it, these homes are littered through the residential streets of La Jolla, and I think they might help us better define what is truly La Jolla more than most. And then there's oddities, and I have to throw this picture in because it's such a great house. Ken Kellogg throws everything out the window, right? As soon as I get on a thread, then there's Ken Kellogg, and he completely disrupts everything. But again, a number of Ken Kellogg projects are in La Jolla. He's a San Diegan. It's this odd thing that is just as much San Diegan as a Mediterranean tile-roofed house that harkens back to the San Diego mission, and nothing really else, right? The Moors, as far as I know, didn't invade San Diego and build a community here, right? So here's this nutty, wonderful human being that gets a crazy client in the La Jolla Farms neighborhood and says, just do it, just go for it. And you say, that's La Jolla, right? That's La Jolla more than having to fit into a defined box of an understanding we have of what residential architecture should be. For those that have ever experienced Ken Kellogg or his architecture, or both, it's like There's nothing more Ken Kellogg than this moment in time when you just look at that and you're like, is that a house? Is that a boat? Is it, what is that? And what must it be like to live in a space like that? Is it a home? Is it homey? Is it warm? Is it comfortable? And all these things come to mind in just that second, right? That blast of when that image hits the screen. You're like, that's a house? And that's Ken Kellogg? And even more so that I find fascinating is the context, okay? So that's the house, and that's Mount Soledad. And you sit there and say, everything here we would understand as residential architecture. We're like, oh, that's a house. When my kid grabs a crayon and draws a slept roof and a little chimney and a little curly-cue of smoke come out, you're like, that's a house. And then you say, but contextually, in La Jolla at least, that's a house. And it starts thinking about how unique La Jolla is. It doesn't have to fit in a box. It never has fit in a box. It never will fit in a box. And as the drafting process goes, and you could probably imagine an engineer and an architect will collaborate and find house space still, right? There's still room probably for a very vertically challenged lot to put a house on. Yeah. But, and maybe they'll sell their backyards and this will all be, but you're like, wow. The fabric of La Jolla is so rich and dense and so broad and so deep at the same time that a picture like that is like, wow, Ken's property can actually fit in with that context. So, and I'm glad to see Robert Moser actually sitting up here in the front because we're going to talk in June. He and I are going to be up here, I guess, and we're going to do a whole thing about Robert Moser's career. But you can't really talk about La Jolla without talking about some of his projects. And one of the projects that I think is really fascinating to use as just an isolated item is one address, just a stone's throw from here. The Scripps Cottage by Irving Gill was appropriated and renamed, and there's a whole history about how that transaction happened, which is great. But if we just look at it as a piece of property, it's an address, we say, okay, Irving Gill, one of his best houses, arguably at the time. You're like, wow, that's La Jolla. And then this art center thing happens, and the board changes, and I don't know if you all are familiar with that history, but as the board changes and the mission changes and the name changes to the La Jolla Museum, things start actually happening to the building itself. And as those drafts go through, one of the most interesting drafts, I think, of any building, because it was an existing building that was obviously reinterpreted through Robert Moser and Roy Drew's firm, is this crazy international style that La Jolla hadn't seen yet. Right? This is groundbreaking. Like, what? How did that come about? And of course, it's a museum, and museums and churches are given way more license to do whatever they really want to do. And everyone's like, oh, well, my house has to be square and has to have a chimney and it has to have curlicue smoke. But if it's an art museum, it can go crazy. And in 1950, that was actually pretty crazy. And then in 1960, it got even crazier, where this almost brutalist kind of this concrete facade that has been demonstrated well outside of Southern California, well into Europe and across the country in public buildings. Like, let's do this. Let's go crazy. And then it gets crazier, right? We're in I call it version 4 as if it was software. But Robert Venturi goes haywire on the thing, and you're like, but it's still La Jolla. You can still see the Scripps Cottage. You still know it's the essentially the redrafting process that Robert Moser and his firm went through, but it's postmodern haywire, and yet it's beautiful, right? And we allow that to happen. We want that to happen. That energy can happen because it's happening in La Jolla. One of the interesting things I've come about in how I understand post-war La Jolla is what I think are clusters, and it's rarer for me to find this elsewhere in the community. Generally speaking, you could say, okay, if there's a tract development by a single architect, that's a cluster of houses that look the same, or a condominium development, you're like, okay, they all look the same. But in La Jolla, I find that there's a couple of really fascinating clusters. One is Pueblo Ribera by Rudolf Schindler in the early 1920s. What was, at first glance, it was 12 private little cottages. And I was trying to find this the other day. I actually have had my hands on one of the sales brochures to have people from LA, you'd think, come down to La Jolla and take their clothes off and hang out at Windansea Beach and sip tea and smoke something, and it's so bohemian. It's over the top bohemian. And this brochure is selling this bohemian lifestyle. And it's so radically different from the temperament of La Jolla today, where everyone keeps their clothes on, right? That I know of. And yet, here was this little outpost out in La Jolla back then that said, come to La Jolla and kind of leave your cares behind and spend, spend some time here. I think Deborah Zake is the only one that's really kind of kept that going, that frame of mind going with some of her projects. But this was not just 12 units, and unfortunately we lost some of them to fire. But it poses some questions about how we behave as La Jollans, how we behave as people. That what was going on there doesn't really, that we know of, happen in the public space anymore. It can't happen in that street anymore. And those are very highly priced, coveted condominiums today. So we've seen the drafting process kind of change, but it's still one of the most wonderful buildings in all of San Diego. And if you read the coffee table book on Rudolf Schindler, it's one of his largest projects throughout the rest of his career. And yet it's here in our neighborhood, and something that I always think that we should rejoice a little bit more and showcase a little bit more. There's 24 houses in a neighborhood called Scripps Estates Associates, which is another cluster that I found really funny and interesting. I assume you all know the history where there was sort of like a Jewish ghetto, more or less, established for all the wrong and all the right reasons adjacent to the UCSD campus. And it happened in a moment in time. Roger Revelle lends this opportunity to some key faculty he's trying to recruit, and architects like Albert Frey and Locke Crane and Russell Forrester in what is, in a timeline of La Jolla history, a blink of an eye, creates an entire neighborhood that for the most part is somewhat intact, and when you go there it's like stepping back in time. Now yes, people have been remodeling these homes and some have been torn down, but it is one of the wildest case studies I've ever seen of having a bunch of local architects, local professors from the local university descend upon this very finite piece of land, and arguably a pretty awesome piece of land. And when you drive through there and experience what is still intact, it's like nothing else in all of San Diego. And I'd argue outside of some pockets in LA and some pockets in Palm Springs, there's really nothing that was spearheaded in such a fashion. And the clustering creates a body of work that's really profound. One of the first series of tract homes in La Jolla and spread about the UTC area and all the way down south into North Pacific Beach is these Palmer and Chrysler tract homes. La Jolla and I think a lot of communities have always suffered the wrath and this problem of tract housing, and yet this and many other examples are a developer hiring a really, really, really good architect to make low-cost housing on a mass scale. And these, while they've been remodeled and many have been torn down, when you find these still intact in La Jolla, there's something, I mean, I hate to be silly, but there's something about my heart when I see them. It's like seeing a Craftsman Cottage or a Green and Green up in Pasadena that is just exactly in that moment in time when it was built. And it's so rare because we've dismissed the value of tract housing, so we've okayed it culturally to remodel the heck out of them. So when you find one that's intact, which there are fewer and fewer of them, a tract house can actually have a unique and special quality to the passerby. And these, I think, are some of the best in La Jolla, and they bespeak a career that I think Palm Springs got more famous for. Like, they built these crazy tract homes. They're all glass, and they were wonderfully indoor, outdoor living, and they're all in Palm Springs. But actually, there's a great number of them in La Jolla as well. Henry Hester did this wonderful thing in the 60s and early 70s. Is he capitalized on narrow lots. Most of these homes are on Torrey Pines Road, but this one's off Prospect as you enter from the east. One of the things I was thinking about this is it's not a cluster in the sense that they're all like a tract, but he came up with a couple of design concept ideas, principally for narrow lots, and he built a whole bunch of them. And every time I see one, most of them are not intact, I'll be honest with you. But the Jerome residence is perfectly kept up. But it's not anything more than responding to narrow lots. And obviously in the drafting process and the price of real estate in La Jolla, narrow lots and subdividing lots becomes a curiosity for all of us. So somebody was already thinking about that and developing some really interesting principles of how to create a lot of house on a narrow lot. The other key cluster is 3 houses on Mount Soledad that, while many San Diegans don't know this, everybody in the world that has ever looked at post-war architecture knows what this facility of 3 houses is. These pictures, while maybe not this picture, pictures of these 3 houses have been internationally published by Julius Schulman and authors of many books about his photography in countless languages in every continent in the country. And I would argue that most people that drive up and down Via Capri never think about just taking a simple turn and seeing what is one of the widest publicized and marketed houses outside of San Diego, right? Like we don't know what's even here, but everybody, people from Norway and Japan and Texas, they all come here and they go to these houses and they stare at them and they knock on the doors and upset the owners. But also wonderful about this photo is that up where UCSD is today, there's nothing. And this is all the way into the 60s. So what La Jolla is as far as infill is actually very, very, very recent. And here is looking south. So you see above, there's no other properties on Mount Soledad above it. And whether you like the architecture or not, it's not even a question. It's like, that's just a neat photo, right? Because like, there was a time, and this was less than 50 years ago, that the majority of Mount Soledad was undeveloped. So the draft we're in the timeline is very brief. We've only done this fairly recently. In North Pacific Beach, there's another example of these clusters that make use of narrow lots. And the reason I bring this up is the concept. The concept is actually quite humorous, because every time I see this, which is a fairly recent design by Sebastian Mariscal, I think of this. And I can't deny just the geometry's got this similarity, this vocabulary. But again, 40, 50 years ago, we're puzzled by narrow lots and infill and trying to make density a reality. And we're still suffering and struggling and championing that and achieving that years later. Lou Dominy put a tract on Playa del Norte. There's a couple of these houses. And again, there's a connection, these little clusters that when people say, Keith, I want to see some architecture from this period, I want to see things that have done this well, I can point them to these little neighborhoods, these little addresses where wonderful work is being done. And it's not just there's one house and then everything around it has nothing to do with it. It's always fun to say, stop here and you can see a few things. So I always point to examples like this and say, there's 6 of these all in a row, and they're really, really wonderful. And they're quite different from contextually what's around it, but they're just really, really, really unique. And that's the new draft, right? That's what La Jolla looks like in the future. There's more and more of those than there are single-family houses on 1+ acre lots. It's just not going to happen. That's the math of the next draft. So how do we deal with that? How do we wrestle with that as a community? How do we contextualize it in the timeline is really up for us to decide. Key to the rest of the speaker series, and hopefully you'll attend all of them or most of them, is I'm not an architect and they are. So they're going to talk about their work and their influences and the materials and the siting and the mathematics of being an architect. And for me, the love affair really is like, what can you see from the street? And I always think about houses that demonstrate something from the street, whether you understand it or not, or you like it or not, really isn't of concern. It's like, when you look at that, do you have an emotional reaction? You have to, right? You have to. Even if it's just to the fact that it's a black and white image, like, oh, that's something old. That's okay. But that is essentially not even there anymore. And that's not for me to really argue about preservation. The house, for the most part, is still there. For some reason, the people didn't like what that demonstrated to the pedestrian, to the neighborhood. And it takes a fairly bold homeowner to continue to maintain that kind of facade, right? I mean, you're like, no, this is my house, and don't you forget it. It really is quite a statement from the street. And then a lot of houses that I'm a fan of, which my work and most of my interest is in the architecture of the immediate post-war years in the county, is a lot of houses just completely turn themselves inward and away from the street. And that is a bold move in and of itself, right? There's no porch swing, there's no picture window facing the street, there's no acceptance of the street, there's no interaction, even though it's cut off by the building itself, but there's no attempt to like say, yes, I'm part of the street. And in this case, La Jolla Farms is very much like that. I mean, for those of you that live there or don't, you know, La Jolla, I mean, all those houses pretty much don't like each other, right? They don't line up, they don't approach each other, they don't embrace each other. And this is one of those houses that absolutely has no interest, right, in the other houses. But then there's a house like this up on Carrizo Drive above Country Club and Fairway that is very much part of its site in a rural setting. And by contrast, that La Jolla Farms is pretty well developed. We could all agree on this house, and for the most part, this picture is if you took a contemporary photo, it would look pretty close to this. The Copley property is essentially that hillside beyond, and it's about to be redeveloped, right? There's something like 10 houses being designed for that hillside beyond. But in the midst of a eucalyptus grove, Fred Liebhardt built a house for himself, for a couple of clients and a couple of kids. And so there's now 5, you know, Fred Liebhardt houses in this little canyon that are all clustered together. And if someone asks me, which has happened before, believe it or not, where can I go see Fred Liebhardt's work? I'm like, here's an address where you can stand and pretty much see, you know, the body of work across many decades. The unique value to this property also is that his first firm, his first office was in the backyard in what, if anyone has anyone been to Taliesin West in Arizona? A canvas-roofed lean-to was where he was drawing the first buildings he designed in La Jolla, and it's part of it is still in the backyard of this property, and it pretty much looks as rural as it does today, as it does in this picture, which was taken in about 1950. You know, again, there's a lot of dynamic qualities to how the way houses look from the street. And again, it's always like when a new slide shows up, what does it do? What does it make you feel like? What is that? How do I react to that? And you know, thankfully, some of us in this room, I'm sure, have been in the house and know the owners, and it's a fascinating M.C. Escher-like experience where you're really trying to understand the environment while you're in it. It's very much a real, visceral architectural experience where you're constantly putting the puzzle together as you walk through it. And yet, from the street, when I tell people to drive by, they go, what? I don't understand. Like, where is the house? Like, where's the room? And the problem's more the facade than it is what goes on beyond it, right? I mean, it's a very, very elegant space inside and very workable for a family. But from the street, it's always really interesting to say, what does architecture do from a pedestrian standpoint? And if you had the designer in here, he would completely tell you a different thing, right? He would never come at you or talk about this project from my perspective, which is, if you walk up to it, that's what it looks like, and what do you do? How do you deal with that? Is that part of La Jolla? Is that the fabric of La Jolla? Will continued clients for architects continue to demonstrate their whimsy and their bravado at the street level in the future, or will they grow more conservative? And certainly one of the most recent examples, and I've actually talked to a lot of people that hate this house, and I actually like that. I like that, right? John Siegel's a friend of mine, and Elizabeth, you're in the room, right? You sold this house, didn't you? I mean, you know, it's just the craziest, most wonderful space, and I assume everyone in the room remembers when it looked like this and there was a gas station on it, right? I mean, there was a gas station on it. And Jonathan, if he was up here, would tell you the hell he had to go through to get the gas out and the oil out and all that stuff, and he had to dig this big hole. But it's the unlikeliest of lots. And I talked about the vertically challenged lot on Mount Soledad a minute ago. Here's a triangulated problem, right? The lot is the problem, even though it's flat and buildable and it's right in the middle of a great street. Sure, why not?
What street is it on?
That's it's
Prospecting Kate.
Prospecting Kate.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So as a kid, I don't want to age myself and age anyone in this room, but like, you know, a few years ago, it was a gas station. And in the drafting process, as the gas station loses utility, it doesn't function as a profitable entity. So it goes up for sale, and rather than being an auto shop or any oil, quick change, oil lube thing, right? Because it had this environmental hazard below it. Somebody says, well, you know, property is so valuable in La Jolla. I'm gonna demonstrate the value by building a home on it. So the most unlikely of circumstances will yield another part of La Jolla. And this picture just kind of gives you that sense of the triangulation of the lot. But as a kid or as a teen or as someone that was just passing through only a few years ago, as a gas station, I would never have thought that this would ever become a residential lot. And the little jewel, for those that don't know, that little relief piece is by a San Diego sculptor, Malcolm Leland. And I was having a water with Jonathan Siegel one afternoon, and I said, you know, La Jolla doesn't have that much public art outside of what MCASD does. There's not a lot of places you walk, you just happen upon a sculpture. And everybody that drives east and hits this even for a moment in time sees a Malcolm Leland piece. And it's an interesting kind of question to ask why we don't all put public art on our driveway or our garage door, so everyone that comes by goes, hey, they like art. You know, and then what it would do is it would be on our responsibility. Our checkbook would put public art or put art into a public space. And you know, for any number of reasons, Jonathan and his wife Wendy decided to give that to La Jollans as they drive by. And again, I don't mean you have to like the architecture. It never has to be that question. It just certainly brings a topic to mind. From the pedestrian's view, as you navigate La Jolla, there's a couple of banks that I just like to kind of put in another clustering category. They're all banks by Moser and Drew, and they've changed over the years. The utility of what goes on inside them has changed. The cars that park in front of them have changed. But I tend to just not want to forget some of the institutional architecture that has told us what La Jolla was, at least at the time that it was built. The first floor of this is what, a Tommy Bahama now, and it looks like Fashion Valley, right? It looks like you know, Mission Valley. But not to malign the people that designed that, but these structures create a sense of memory. For those of us in the room, I assume most of us have been in the area for some period of time. When we see that building, we're like, oh, I know exactly where that is. I know exactly how it functions. I know how it behaves. I know about how old it was. You don't have to know who the architect was, and you don't have to know that these light fixtures are on Keith's most wanted list. I'm trying to find those. You don't have to know that. But you go, that building is something, there's something about in La Jolla. And certainly the Bank of La Jolla, which was UCB Bank for a while. I mean, you know, as I said, the drafting process changes the business owner, but you know, there's some really neat stuff that you just kind of have to walk around and enjoy as a pedestrian. Because I have a website, people contact me from everywhere outside of San Diego. I want to learn more about San Diego. San Diegans don't bother to really get in touch with me very often, which is not a problem. I just, you know, once you're on the internet, you know, all of a sudden you become accessible to a whole bunch of other architecture geeks from around the world. And generally speaking, I hate to admit this, I tell them to go to the Mesa a lot. I tell them to go to this. There's a couple of buildings up on the Mesa that they can see, for the most part, they can see from the street, and they can see, and they know the architects, right? They don't have to say, I don't know who Fred Liebhardt was because the majority of his buildings were in La Jolla, and I don't know who that is. I'm from Australia or New Zealand or wherever. And so Pereira and Luckman were a very productive firm after World War II, most of the work being in Los Angeles, very well publicized, published photos in all kinds of architecture forum, et cetera. And they didn't do a lot in San Diego, but what they did was you know, put nuclear reactors in your neighborhood. You know, that's at least worth something. I was at a dinner party. Elizabeth, I don't know if you were there or not, but someone said, there was like this quiz, like everyone's drinking wine, and everyone said, so someone said, how many nuclear reactors are in San Diego? And no one thought there was any, right? We're like, there's no nuclear reactors in San Diego. Oh, San Onofre. And then we started counting all the submarines, all the aircraft carriers, all the laboratories, General Atomics being one of them, that were actually through our colonizing of San Diego County, have been running nuclear reactors all around us. And it was just kind of one of those fun moments where you're like, oh, how does that fit into the context of what it means to be a La Joillan or a San Diegan? Edward Durrell Stone, very heavily written about, widely published throughout the world. His work is well known. A church in Poway got torn down 2 years ago because they didn't like it. And yet people from outside of town, from away from the zip code, they couldn't even believe it. Like, complete disbelief that someone would tear down an Edward Durrell Stone building. And yet, and I don't, for all those that are spiritually inclined in the room, a church is a sovereign nation, and they can actually build and tear down and remodel anything that the rest of us might from the outside say is historic. They have license to do so. So when a church decides that they want to look like strip mall architecture in Mission Valley, they can do that. And what they take away is one of two buildings we had by this wonderful, profound architect. And the good news is you can tell people to drive by Scripps Green Hospital and go, oh my God, that is just amazing. It's really, really an amazing building. For those of you who've been there and just discounted it as just a big hospital, go across the street and look at it from a wider angle. It really is one of the greatest buildings in the county. The Salk is an easy one. It's low-hanging fruit in the discussion, right? Everyone's like, oh yeah, the Salk, of course, it's great, yeah. When was the last time you went there is always my question. When was the last time you spent 45 minutes with your cell phone off enjoying this space? Because I'll tell you right now, people from around the world that you've never met, that don't stay in your hotel or in your neighborhood or your friend, they come in town just to see this and leave. This is the architectural tourism that happens in our county. People around the globe think that this building is important. Very few San Diegans, if you looked at their calendar in the last month, have gone there. And I mean, we have to go there every time. It's not like a park, right? But it is a very profound, peaceful place. I find it interesting because I'm really curious what the heck is going on in those buildings, those labs. Like they're making something that we can't even imagine, right? They're solving a problem or curing a disease that most of us can't even get our head around, and yet we can walk. I mean, they don't have security guards kicking people off the property. You can actually enjoy the space. And I was talking to an architect friend of mine, and he understands Louis Kahn, and he said this is the most important building west of the Mississippi, because there's obviously important buildings in Boston and in St. Louis and in New York City and yada, 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 right? But he said, if you go west of the Mississippi, there's less truly iconic, long-lasting, historic, whatever you want to, however you want to define it. And it's an interesting question because New York, just for one city, right, was built up and built dense, and there's a lot of great architecture in New York. But then when you go, as you travel west, as if you were in a wagon and you were being pulled by horses, right, there's just less over time, right? You don't think of like the most important building in North America being in Tucson, do you? I mean, it's not that there's bad architecture, it's just there's less. And there's, Denver or Colorado has just less architecture because most of it is not built, right? Most of the state is still somewhat rural. So we get all the way out to the west coast and just about to fall in the ocean, literally. And there's this building, and I don't know if anyone at Conviz has ever tried to gauge, how many dollars this building brings in, but it's a blip. I mean, it's on the radar that people travel here for this. And certainly, if you haven't been lately, I venture to say publicly that you should trespass on this property at will, right? I mean, this is one of the most important spaces in the county. If you just want to experience architectural viscerally, like even if you don't like it, you have to deal with it in this space, right? It is just so, I was using the term futuristic once, and I realized that that's kind of like the silliest word ever, right? Because you can't actually ever be in the future, but it's futuristic. It's about the closest thing that you would imagine the next draft of La Jolla to be. this is where they would be playing a sport that hasn't been invented yet. They'd be wearing clothes that are made of plastic. It's like all the, but it's very real for the people that work there. They just live in that space. So I kind of like put you into the Mesa space, which is where crazy science is going on and people are solving the medical problems of today and tomorrow. But more close to home, more close to like our lives, I find that La Jolla and our climate should propel us to be in this engagement with the outdoors. When we're indoors, we should understand what's going on outdoors. When we're outdoors, we should feel like we're indoors. And I think I've been convinced of this by the media, that we should be accepting and living in the environment that we live in, because we don't live in Minnesota and we're not fearful of being outside for all the right reasons. So I said, like, where's the backyard in La Jolla anymore? And have any of you given any thought to well, I don't have a balcony or I have a window that opens. That's not what I'm talking about, but like a real like space where you live outdoors. And one could say, we live outdoors differently, right? This outdoor barbecue fad that we're in right now didn't happen then, right? People weren't spending $25,000 to have an outdoor kitchen then. That was their backyard. It was to engage and to enjoy the solitude of their own backyard, the environments. This is not a robust landscape plan by any measure, but that chaise lounge is way far away from the house, and you get the sense that it was just for some peace and quiet to read a book. And in urban living, how often do we have spaces, and what do those spaces look like anymore? And who does water features in their landscape anymore? I mean, who sits and thinks of the gurgling and bubbling of a little pond as magical? And we try to incorporate that now to to drown out traffic noise or our neighbor, right? But imagine, if you will, just for this moment in time, that this is a house in La Jolla Farms, and it doesn't look like this. I'll just say that anymore. But this idea where there was this magical space outside of your house, and there was floor-to-ceiling glass where you were attempting at least to blur the line between the two, the indoor and the outdoor. This is La Jolla Farms only 40 years ago, 50, I don't know, I'm doing math, 50 years ago. And there was a heck of a lot of backyard in La Jolla fairly recently. And I keep thinking, like, this is completely filled in, obviously. I'm not saying anything you don't understand, but just the solemnity, the kind of that quiet idea, not just that it's a black and white photo, but it's really something about the climate, the outdoor space, and now what we do. This is what we do with our backyards. We have to, we're in an urban setting. We're slicing and dicing land in ever finer slivers. And we have a lap pool slammed up against the house. And there's no transition other than the glass just saying, well, maybe the pool's in the living room, maybe the living room's in the pool, we don't really know, which is great visually. But in an urban setting, that becomes the new backyard. And what I'm trying to do is just think forward, right? So we have a kiddie pool on a balcony, and that's the next iteration. It gets ever smaller, ever tighter, ever more difficult to actually, as a La Jollan, enjoy the climate. And that's really, really, really strange if you start thinking about it. I get it if you're in Minnesota, like, all lock yourselves in, turn the heat on, fine. But in La Jolla, I always fear that we're losing a sense of what is the backyard. And what the backyard becomes is this hopefully, this living room, right? You hope that you've got a couch with cloth fabric pillows on it, because really, you don't have to worry about the ice on the pillow, right? So why not have an upholstered couch outdoors? I hope a nice one, right? Not on your front porch maybe, but certainly on your back porch. And then the ultimate backyard, right? Which is actually the only house that actually sits on the sand. And I can't tell enough people to go try to find this house, because it's always like, I've never seen that. I'm like, you haven't seen it? Well, A, no one will ever admit to going to Black's Beach in the 70s and 80s. That's part of the problem. But it is very difficult to get to, even for the owners that have this horrific tramway that even if it was licensed and insured and bonded and repaired and maintained, you still would freak out. You would just like, no, I'm not going to go down there. But if you walk down there, it's the ultimate backyard, right? These people actually built, I don't know legally if it happened or who was on duty at the time that the permit got issued, but the ultimate backyard, which is just fun. I think again, it would never happen anywhere else but La Jolla. It's just fun. Again, back to this idea of clustering and the idea of neighborhoods is as a La Jollan, you generally think of the residential area, the village, like where you do your shopping, you kind of interact with your friends, and then there's this whole other neighborhood that is it's a different topic entirely. I mean, you could do a whole series of symposia and presentations on what happened, how it was created, where it is now, where it's going, but it's a completely different way of thinking about neighborhoods. And it's not just the students, right? There's 50-odd thousand people on that campus every day working, studying, doing research, selling. You know, there are vendors on that campus like you would believe the salespeople that are walking around UCSD trying to appropriate a chunk of the $1 billion in research dollars that came to the campus last year. Imagine that, you know, somebody gets $1 billion and there's a lot of people going, hey, I can help you spend that, right? So there's parking lots are full, people are taking the bus there, they're carpooling there, they're bicycling there, they're walking there. There's tens of thousands of people in this neighborhood, and it is part of La Jolla, but it works very differently. And from the perspective of enjoying architecture, you have to say, well, we can look house by house or church by church or civic building by civic building and understand kind of how 92037 works. But then when you say, well, how did this neighborhood work? Because so many people that live in La Jolla only live here because UCSD. They came here for work, they came here for school, they came here as a vendor or a company that has leached onto this institution and profits from it. There's so many symbiotic relationships between all the biotech and Qualcomm millionaires that can afford to live in La Jolla because what the university essentially as the hub of a wheel spun out. So just real quickly is a really early drawing of how the campus may have looked by Robert Alexander has been called the Champs-Élysées. It's very formal, it's very stuffy, it's very uptight, it's very European. It doesn't look like La Jolla, and obviously it didn't get built this way, but if you think about how La Jolla would have reacted or behaved and how the two would have been synergistically connected, you'd say that architecture doesn't look like La Jolla. That doesn't look like us, right? But what happens is they built a bunch of little villages, a bunch of little neighborhoods instead. Each of these a college, each of them a neighborhood, several of them having an architectural program that unifies or a landscaping program that unifies. And on the ground level, as a pedestrian, they're very discrete neighborhoods that do kind of connect better, I think, to the landscape, the environment, and the greater La Jolla community. There's little parks everywhere. At Scripps, the firm Wimmer and Yamada designed this little park. There's lots of trees. There's mixed use. They're walkable neighborhoods just like your residential streets are. The architecture is in some cases very profound, in some cases fairly mundane, and in some cases very ecocentric. It's just, you know, there's a little bit of everything, but the idea is that they're all kind of little neighborhoods with parking areas and walking areas. There are some pretty heavy concrete buildings, and there's some tall buildings. I was thinking about a whole chapter in this discussion about the high rise in La Jolla, right? Anything over 4 stories, and people are like, oh my gosh. You know, if you start counting the ugliest buildings, the buildings that are more demanding on your eye, they're all the taller buildings in La Jolla, and because there's few of them. And you say, well, gosh, there's a lot of tall buildings on the UCSD campus, but it's okay. It's almost accepted because it's a university. But neighborhoods can have a proper engagement with a high rise. One of the ways you do it is build in residential housing into the public sector building, right? The neighborhood and the lab are right next door to each other. The restaurant and the bank and the dry cleaner and the housing are all next to one another. Certainly like here in the John Muir College campus. But landscaping is very important, keeping the buildings low and keeping the pedestrian view, the approach at a human scale. There's wonderful neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood, and they're all named. Like there are street names. I mean, they are proper La Jolla neighborhoods. There's lots of activities. There's lots of lawn. There's swimming and there's basketball courts. I mean, it is a city unto itself, and the architectural program is so much different than the residential part of La Jolla. So you start saying, well, how did La Jolla grow up? How did UCSD grow up? And they grew up very differently, but the program's different, right? These buildings don't exist out in the residential community of La Jolla, but they do exist here. And the interplay, I think, is quite wonderful, especially if you take a census of the people in the residential neighborhoods of La Jolla that engage with the university and demand the university be productive, right? They live, they work, they study, they've graduated, they're emeriti faculty. There's so much synergy there that it almost has to be a walkable neighborhood and be part of La Jolla. And some of these drawings I just love because I love renderings like this that are seemingly less about the building and more about the human scale, about the people. And as the designers of UCA San Diego's buildings and landscape have gone through these iterations, it's always trying to figure out the human scale and the neighborhood quality and the interplay between the outdoor space and the indoor space. Most of the buildings aren't shut off to the elements. Most of the buildings have patios. The vice chancellor I work for has a patio with a barbecue off of his office. And every time I sit in his office, there's a floor-to-ceiling glass, and there's his patio. It's just the most unique thing because, again, we're not in Minnesota. I have to bring this up because our reaction, our interplay, those of us that are not professional architects or retired architects is like, how do we behave? How do we react? How do we think? How do we enjoy? How do we hate? If it's good architecture or bad, it's not really the question. It's do you have a response to it, right? Do you have an opinion? Because if I go into the grocery store and don't have an opinion about the space, then I just go in and mechanically do my commerce, my transaction, and I leave. But if I go in and I think about the ceiling height, or I think about how I approached it, or I think like, why was aisle 12 and the stuff in aisle 12 over there? And if I start thinking about it, then I'm actually relating to architecture. And my point about aesthetics is really that there's the Craftsman bungalow, and there's the stucco Spanish Mediterranean revival, and there's the Irving Gill, and there's the crazy organic stuff that Ken Kellogg presents, and there's the modernist square boxes. But then there's this period in time in La Jolla's history that grapples with fads and grapples with the times. It grapples with change in aesthetics. And MCASD is certainly a prize winner or a victim, depending on how you feel about it. But the lobby space is very unique. There's just no getting around it. If you stand there for a moment, it's unlike any other lobby to any other arts institution in the world. It's just really, really, really unique. And on a grand scale, it's like you have to deal with this when you drive down the 5. Whether you like it or not, it's there, it's in your face. It's very strange, right? I mean, Michael Graves puts his signature in one address in town, and you say, I'm not quite sure I know where the hotel begins and the commercial parts of this property begin. It's a really odd series of questions to think about, and it is just a Hyatt, right? You can just drive by and go, I'm not staying there, I'm not going to a conference, it doesn't matter. But when you see it, I don't know how many of you can't or have yet to have a reaction to this building. It's just like you see it and you go, huh. And that, I think, is the important part of La Jolla, is that something happens, right? Something happens, and La Jolla continues to offer us many opportunities for us to at least think. So I'll leave you just going back to the quote from Mark, is that really where we're at is the middle part of his quote, right? We're just sort of filling it all in. We're building all the land, and it's the first task, and then you have to go back through and do another layer. And we're at that point in history, right? We're right there. We're dealing with, we're enjoying, we're reveling in it, we're loathing it, but we're dealing with that next draft. Now you can give me the tap.